Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host for the program, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back.
It's great, as always, to be with you. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, I thought we'd discuss something that we've never really talked about on Libertarian Angle, and that is antitrust laws. That as libertarians, it always shocks people that when they learn that we favor the repeal of antitrust laws. And of course, people on the left go ballistic because they think, oh, there's all this big business and monopolies and so forth. But really, we favor the repeal because one thing, we believe in liberty, that people should be free to live their lives the way they want. We believe in private property, where people should be free to do what they want with their property, including combining it with others. And we also know how the market process works, where the consumers are ultimately sovereign, that you don't need to worry about big business or big conglomerates forming in a market economy, because ultimately, if they don't satisfy consumers, they go out of business. So my position is that we don't even really need these things at all, and we can get into some of the destructive aspects of them. That really what we want is a free market. That is a market process that is totally free of any government control or regulation, including antitrust laws. What do you think, Richard?
Well, basically, I totally agree with you. Antitrust laws emerged in the second half of the 19th century in the United States, beginning in the issues began to arise in the 1870s and 1880s, because of the emergence of the American Industrial Revolution. I'm sure most viewers and listeners know that the British Industrial Revolution began in the early years of the 19th century. But America was basically a light industry and agricultural country up to and through the Civil War. But following the Civil War, America went through its industrial transformation, the emergence of large and mass production industry, accumulation of savings and investment in new technologies that often required taking advantage of economies of scale in large enterprises and large factory establishments, all of which resulted in more goods, better quality goods, and as the years went by in the second half of the 19th century, had increasingly lower prices to the consumers because of the cost of production being successfully lowered. Because if you can lower your manufacturing costs to produce more output, then you can successfully then offer the product at a lower price to consumers, and if you've judged the consumer demand correctly, still make a profit. But this did result in the emergence of large industrial firms. Some formed sort of partnerships, amalgamations, trusts as they were called. And there was a movement in the United States that took the attitude that bigness by itself was bad. It involved concentration of wealth, concentration of market power, and that was used as a definition per se almost, saying that it was going to lead to monopolies or competition among a very small few, what is sometimes called oligopoly. And as a consequence of this, markets would be, quote, rigged by the big companies at the expense of the little guy, both the consumers as well as smaller competitors. So it was proposed that there be antitrust laws to come in and basically set the regulations of how large companies could be, what mergers would be allowed, pricing structures that were viewed as monopolistic as opposed to competitive. And all of this culminated in the 1880s and 1890s, and then the first decade of the 20th century, with the implementation of the first antitrust laws. Now, there was a lot of what was called muckraking at that time. You'd have these sort of journalists who would undertake exposés to demonstrate the evils and cruelty and manipulative powers of large companies. But all of this has basically been shown to be, in essence, a fallacy. Just to give one instance, there's an excellent economist named Dom Armentano, and a good number of years ago, he published a couple of books. One is called The Myth of Antitrust, and the other is called Antitrust and Monopoly. And what he did as an economist and an economic historian was to go back and actually look at these famous antitrust cases against U.S. Steel, against the oil industries, and so on. And he demonstrated that, in fact, in every instance, a careful researching of the facts and the detailing of what was going on in these sectors was showing that the concentration of industry did occur because of economies of scale, but there was still rigorous and heavy competition in virtually all of these sectors. And the large companies that were accused of acting in this anti-market monopoly manner, in fact, were gaining larger market share by only one and one means method in virtually every instance. And that is offering more goods of a better quality at lower and lower prices. So, in fact, all of this is basically a mythology. Where does it come from? As many things that dominate our public policy discussions over the last more than 100 years now, it emerged out of the Marxian view of capitalist evolution. Marx had argued that there was a law of the concentration of capital, by which he meant that competition would result in many companies going to the wall. Their resources and assets would be bought up by the remaining surviving companies, resulting in a greater concentration of ownership and control of the means of production. And then another round would occur, and out of this new competition among larger firms, some other firms would be driven to the wall. And as a consequence of that, their assets would be sold off, and the remaining companies again would buy them up, and the degree of concentration and control would become worse and worse. And that the businessmen, therefore, would have the monopoly power to raise prices, reduce quantity, and extract exploitive wealth, not just from their workers, but the consumers as well. Now, the history of this period is virtually the exact opposite. Well, I'm tempted to say all, but I'm going to be academically biased. Almost all predictions of Marx, they have been shown to be fallacious, wrong-headed, and totally inaccurate against the actual trend of events. The other way of looking at this that influenced economists' thinking and therefore policymakers' thinking, without sounding too nerdy for our listeners and viewers, is economists developed this model of perfect competition in the late 19th and especially the beginning of the 20th century. And this idea of perfect competition is that markets are most efficient, cost-efficient, productive, optimally producing when there is a large number of small firms, each of whom is too small, like a drop in a bucket, to influence the market price by varying the amount of output that they produce and contribute to their market. Everyone's a price taker and passively takes the market price and just decides how much to produce at that given market price. Any producer who has the ability to influence the market price by varying whether he produces more or less is then viewed as an imperfect competitor, somehow acting suboptimally and harmful to the consumer. And that model dominated how economists through the last over 100 years have tended to view, are markets efficient or are they inefficient? Are they competitive or are they anti-competitive? Now, one leading response to this was by the famous Austrian-born economist Joseph Schumpeter in his book of 1942 called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He has a long section in which he's explaining how markets actually work, the dynamism of capitalism. And he basically says you can't look at it, take a snapshot, and take the snapshot and say, oh, look at the market. This seems to be inefficient. Prices are far above costs. Somehow this is a manipulative situation. He said that we had to look at the market as a dynamic and vibrant process through time, not a frozen frame picture at a moment in time, but a process through time, including years and decades. And when one takes that longer historical perspective, one sees that capitalism itself assures that any successful entrepreneur, if he cannot stay on top of his game, will be facing new competition, more innovative competition, more cost-effective competition. One way of looking at this to sort of corroborate Schumpeter's view of the market as a dynamic process of what he called creative destruction, innovative replacing the existing with something better, is that if one went to the library and looked at the bound volumes of Fortune magazine, and I'm sure many viewers and listeners know, Fortune for decades now has issued what's called the Fortune 500. What are the largest businesses in the United States, the wealthiest enterprises in the United States or the world? Now, if you did this and you picked a volume from, let's say, the 1930s, 1938, and compared that to that same Fortune 500 volume of some other year in 1947, or another one in 1956, or another one in 1962, and another one in 1979, for example, just to randomly pick years, and you looked at the list of Fortune 500 companies, what one would find is that the companies that were at the top in one year, and maybe for several years, 10 years later, let's say, they're way down on the list, and sometimes they're gone. Because the market, even with government regulation, we're not in a free market, has remained sufficiently open, vibrant, and innovatively creative, and therefore responsive to consumer demand, that firms have gone up and down, the wealth of people have transformed and gone up and down, so that as long as the market has a degree of sufficient competitiveness, in other words, it's not totally strangled by the government through the arm of intervention and control. The fact is, Schumpeter has been shown right, and all those who use these crazy perfect competition models and just look at a frozen moment in time and say, well, look, he's making a big profit. He must be an evil, inefficient monopolist taking advantage of people, is just downright wrong.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. Let me go back to the two books you mentioned, Dominic Armentano. Those books had a big impact on me when I first read them. He was giving the case against antitrust laws. And I recall that he actually detailed the case of Standard Oil of New Jersey, John D. Rockefeller's firm, which I think was the primary basis for the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And Armentano traced what was happening in that industry. He was showing that during the entire time that Standard Oil of New Jersey was getting larger and larger and larger, the price of oil was dropping for consumers. Kind of a strange behavior for a so-called monopolist. And that the way he was getting big was that he was buying everybody out, which was entirely based on voluntary transactions. So you had people, both sides benefiting from the exchange. Otherwise, why would they enter into the exchange? And that what he also found is, if I recall correctly, was that as Rockefeller was buying up these competing firms, there was more firms coming into the market in order to get bought out by Rockefeller. So the point was that as long as you have this free entry into a marketplace, you don't need to worry about the big guy growing bigger and bigger and bigger, that ultimately it's the consumer that's going to be sovereign. Now, let me address something about monopolies. That we know that historically monopolies have been horribly abusive. You go back into British history and in the age of mercantilism, and there's just these horror stories of where monopolies were horrendous to consumers. But what is a monopoly? And this is where I think a lot of the law professors and economic professors in the colleges have such a incorrect view of what a genuine monopoly is. A monopoly is where the state, the government, has granted one company the exclusive privilege to provide a good or service. All others are required to shut down. So it's the only one. A good example of a real genuine monopoly is the postal monopoly, that nobody is permitted to compete in the delivery of first-class mail with the postal monopoly. Well, of course, monopolies are going to be abusive. They don't need to worry about competition. You don't like the way they treated you at the local postal station. Your only option is to go to another postal station run by the same outfit. But that's not the way that it was in the marketplace with Standard Oil or any other big business, Carnegie's firms or whatever, because they didn't have that legal protection. So you've got this consumer sovereignty, and as you pointed out, and with Schumpeter's creative destructionism concept, that the consumers are ultimately the king here. They decide which firms are going to go out of business. I don't care how big a firm is. If they don't satisfy consumers, if they don't keep up with the latest, say, technological edge in the technology field, consumers immediately shift directions. They're a fickle bunch. They may be loyal to a company one day, but boy, somebody comes out with a better mousetrap. better computer, better whatever, they will shift immediately. And so, as you point out, which is, I think is a great point, that all these big firms that are in the top 100, 30 years ago and 30 years before that, 30 years later, they're not in that top list anymore. Now, if they were as powerful as the government and the statists say they were, they would stay on top of the list forever. They would just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Yes. But it's the dynamics of the market that shows you that the consumers ultimately make that call. You don't need government to do it.
A perfect example of this in some of our actual lifetime is the telephone industry. The fact is, for a good part of the 20th century, the telephone industry was a government-bestowed monopoly on AT&T. And for decades, telephone innovation and improvement in terms of consumer convenience basically stagnated. I'm sure many viewers and listeners are old enough, by golly and by cracky, to remember that you used to have a phone that would sit on the desk. And at first it was rotary. And you would like this phone here. Oh, gee, I guess the citadel isn't that updated. But anyway, this was it. And you went no further than the cord could take you. And you got tangled up in the cord trying to talk to somebody and everything else. They had a monopoly in telephone service, that is local and long-distance calls, and in hardware. And as a consequence, virtually no innovation went on for decades. Finally, they said, well, we've gone to use that line from the old musical Oklahoma, by golly, we've gone about as far as we can go. We have introduced push button instead of the rotary dial. Oh, wow. We're making progress now. But in the late 1970s and early 80s, the AT&T's monopoly was ended. Competition was allowed in both telephone service and telephone hardware. What emerged very rapidly? Competing companies. And not just in short, local and long-distance phone call, but in the hardware. And what did that mean? Well, immediately you started seeing cordless phones come on the market in a wide variety of forms and shapes. You could now have a Mickey the Mouse phone. Yes, you held Mickey in your hand, and you talked in his belly button and listened through his nose. And then there was the Garfield the cat phone. And then, of course, without trying to sound too sexist here, women are different than men. And then they came out with the Princess Streamline phone that more delicately fit into the smaller female hand. Oh, yes, just for the woman, the market is so responsive. Now, you still have a stupid long antenna, and if you were too far from the base, it started crackling. Now what happened is that they started developing satellite transmissions for these, until finally, to make a very long story short, we now have this. And this is a telephone. It is our email. It is our text messaging. It is our movies. It is our music. It is everything. But all of this is the result of the deregulation and the ending of a government-bestowed monopoly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This would not have occurred, certainly not into the form or the speed with which it has come on the market, if the government-bestowed monopoly had not been ended. That is the source of stagnation, a lack of innovation, a failure to competitively respond to the wants of the consuming public. Monopoly given by the government, where the existing producer doesn't have to worry about satisfying the consumers because there's no one nipping on his heels to try to gain customer business or a market share that he otherwise might lose. But you open a market to both domestic and to foreign competition, and all of the kind of 99.99999% of the problems that those who are concerned about monopoly, you find that those problems disappear, and you open up the market for an unending stream of improvements that improves the quality and the standard and the cost of our lives each and every day.
Yeah, that's a great example. And this is the type of thing that was going on in the late 1800s, where new inventions were coming out. There was dynamic improvements in all aspects of lives. I mean, it was an exciting time. You've got the automobile industry and the telephone industry and all kinds of new products coming to market. The same thing that, as you point out, is happening with the cell phone industry today. Let me give the flip side, the negative side of what happens when you when you don't have that type of dynamic market. I mean, look at the Postal Service. There's no dynamic improvements there. It's the same little system. You put your stamp on your envelope and you send it out. And people say, well, what would be the alternative? Well, that's the thing about the free market is you don't know. The market brings into existence things that you can't even imagine. Let me give you another example. It's close to home for you is the Federal Reserve. And the reason I say that is because you've got this fantastic new ebook out that FFF has published called Monetary Central Planning in the State. But let's face it, the Fed's a monopoly. It monopolizes the production of money, the supply of money, the management of money. And is it any surprise that we've had all of these booms and busts and bubbles bursting and recessions and depressions? And I mean, it's just a horrible product. And they don't have to worry about competition. We would say abolish the Fed, open up that market, the monetary market, to the free provision of currencies where people are competing in currencies. Public schools, quasi-monopoly. All right, there's a little competition with respect to private schools or homeschooling, but still, let's face it, most people send their kids into this quasi-monopoly, and look, all you hear are horror stories. Horrible product. Everybody agrees it's a bad product. It's a bad system, and there's always these quests for reform. But that's the thing about a monopoly, Richard. It can't be reformed. It's inherently defective. That the only thing is that can provide the best services is the free market. Let me make one more point that you mentioned earlier in your first comment about competition, of how they want to break up these companies because their goal is competition. But really, from a libertarian standpoint, our goal is freedom. And sometimes freedom means that a firm has a right to merge with another firm, even if it means no competition in that market, that they're the only ones providing that service. I mean, there's always a threat of competition as long as there's free entry in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. But as you pointed out, there's good reasons why firms emerge with economies of scale. They're able to keep costs lower sometimes that way. Isn't that true?
Yes. And in fact, not only that, but to show that merely because firms merge and become large in their particular sector or over sectors of the economy, I mean that once they're established, a competition will often show that they made a serious mistake. Again, back in the 1970s, there was this philosophy among large segments of the sectors of the economy that what was desirable was vertical integration. You didn't just like maybe merge horizontally with companies like you, but you also merged with other types of companies that might in one sense be complements, but were part of your supply chain. And so you had all of these conglomerate mergers in the 1970s. And they said this will be efficient, this will internalize a lot of the decision-making and the production, and this will make us more effective. But in fact, after such conglomerates came into existence, many of them were found that they were in fact too large. They started suffering from bureaucratic problems and inefficiencies. And in fact, by now expecting that some other division that they had absorbed had to supply them with something along the supply chain, and therefore were committed to having to buy their internal version of a component part or some sub-product, the result was they were losing the ability to buy from outside the firm. And therefore, many of these conglomerates, in fact, divested themselves precisely because they found that they had expanded in ways that were not cost efficient and satisfactory towards making that better product for the consumer vis-a-vis their competitors who had not undertaken this conglomerate structure. So, in fact, merely because the market permits, a free market permits such integration and merging, does not mean that it will be sustainable if at the bottom, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that, in fact, it is not demonstrable as efficient and productive and producing the products that consumers want in the most effective way. And they will either divest themselves or be driven out of business, as a few of them were. So the market itself has its own natural testing and correction. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises often emphasized that the market is an ongoing and competitive weeding out process. The entrepreneur is self-selecting. He doesn't have to get elected by a majority like in the political process. If he has confidence and is a bit of a risk taker, he can take his own savings or the savings of someone who has lent it to him, and he can try to make that better mousetrap and attempt to be innovative. But at the end of the day, the voter in this case in the marketplace is the consumer. And if the entrepreneur, whether he be small, medium, or large in terms of market share, does not continually satisfy the consumers, he will suffer losses instead of making profits. His resource base will get smaller because his financial wherewithal to sustain his size will have gotten less. And if he doesn't mend his ways in time, he will go bankrupt. And that is the case with large firms as well as small firms. Another way of also thinking about this open innovativeness, part of the reason why there was a push for some of these antitrust laws, at least on the part of some, in the era of the railroads, is that it was said, well, other than riding a horse or taking a boat where a river permits, we're stuck having to transport either cargo or people on railroads. And here are a handful of railroad lines, and they have, quote, semi-monopoly control of a lot of transportation in the United States. Who could ever compete against that? The capital investment that's involved. But again, if you take Schumpeter's view of looking at competition as a dynamic process across time, what you see is that the railroads were undermined, not by the government coming in and regulating them or divesting them, but through the innovations of the market in two important ways, the automobile and the airline. Whereas at the end of the Second World War, for instance, the troops came back and in that old song that Peggy Lee made famous, waiting for the train to come in 1945, the husband or the boyfriend was coming back from the war, waiting at the train station for the train to come in. Nobody waits at the train station for the train to come in anymore. We drive. We take a plane. I mean, now the market did that, not government regulation. So again, that's another example of the dynamism of Schumpeter's point. Now, if you want to go to the train station and keep waiting, Bumper, you go ahead. But hey, I'm not. I will not join you. I'm taking a plane.
Hey, let me tell you something. As somebody who grew up on trains, I grew up on the train. My dad was an attorney and represented a railroad company, so we had a free pass on the railroad. And right. I love the train. I mean, I took Amtrak across the country a couple of years ago and had an absolute blast. But there you're talking about a monopoly again. I mean, Amtrak's a government monopoly, and
absolutely,
they ought to be divested. I mean, made privatized, and if they can survive, fine. If they can't, that's fine. But there's also other distortions. I mean, the government builds the interstate highway system, which is this public works boondoggle, and then yes, which is effectively a free subsidy to the automobile industry. So it destroys the railroad industry. So you have all these distortions. Yes. Now, another thing I wanted to mention about the market process that you were talking about is the takeover artist, too. He plays an invaluable role in this. When the company gets too big and too bureaucratic, you've got these takeover guys that come in here and start buying up the stock. And it's part of the market process again. It's a way to – now the big companies hate these guys. But they're like a check, right, Richard?
Yes. Absolutely. It's called a hostile takeover. That is, someone comes in and offers to buy a corporation's shares at some price above the current market price of those shares. Now, shareholders often sell. This is a bargain. The going market price for the share is X, and this guy is coming along and offering X plus 2 or 3. Now, from whose perspective is it a hostile takeover? Not the shareholders who are finding it attractive to sell at an above market price, or the remaining shareholders who are persuaded by the hostile takeover people that they can manage the company more effectively and more efficiently over the long run to enhance its profitability. To whom is it a hostile takeover? Existing management who have obviously failed in someone's eyes to effectively manage the corporation to keep costs down, products innovative, and profits as high as that market will hypothetically permit. They're concerned about losing their jobs. It's only hostile from the existing powers that be who have not been able to demonstrate in the eyes of some people that they're as competitive as others think they can make the company. And that is another way that the market constantly is shifting control and assuring that big companies, small companies, medium-sized countries are constantly focused on one thing, doing better than the rival to see that the consumers either come to you or remain loyal to enhance market share over the long term.
Yeah, you see that all the time. I mean, the private companies, even big companies like Microsoft or Amazon or whatever, they're always out there trying to come up with new and different and better ways, more innovative ways to please the customer. They know that ultimately the customer is the king in the market process. So you really don't need the state. You don't need antitrust laws. Best to just ditch and get rid of them. On that note, Richard, we're out of time. Go ahead. Did you make one? Did you want to make a comment there?
Well, just a quickie. There's a great movie that maybe some of the viewers and listeners have seen on the themes of these takeovers to make companies more efficient and to sell off branches that are no longer profitable. Other People's Money with Danny DeVito and Gregory Peck. And Danny DeVito is the person who buys up assets to sell them off into different chunks where they no longer have been profitable and efficient on what they historically are doing. So over the long run, markets in general are doing a better job. It's a great movie. Danny DeVito, Other People's Money.
So there you have it, a movie review here on the Libertarian Angle. And also go out and buy Richard's great new ebook, Monetary Central Planning in the State. It's on Amazon. It's on our website at fff.org. That's this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Richard, enjoyed it as always. And we'll see you next week.